What is the root cause of addiction? How does addiction start? I'm no psychologist, I'm no doctor, but it seems that addiction begins with a single thought. You might be having dinner with some friends or family, and then a single thought, either in your own mind or planted by someone at the table or the waiter or waitress, it, they suggest a drink, an alcoholic drink. That's the first thought. And you may or may not have the drink. That's not the point. You might or might not accept that idea or take up that thought. But at every stage from the first thought, you have a choice. The choice is either to just go with the thought, go along with the thought, or the other choice is to analyze the thought and its possible consequences and determine if that's the way you want to go in life. So someone suggests it, or your own mind suggests having a drink, you have a drink. Now, it's a few weeks later, the same thought comes up, why not have a drink? You have a drink. Maybe one drink isn't enough, you add another half drink, and you get the same kick out of it. And at every stage, again, you can analyze where you're going with these thoughts, where these thoughts will take you, and where you'll end up in life if you continue to go along with the thoughts. And ultimately, a few months later, you might be having several drinks a day. Again, at this point, it's going to be more difficult to analyze the thought of having a drink because you have experienced the pleasure of the drink so many times. So it's difficult to separate yourself from it and stand back and analyze where it's leading you in life. And that's why a lot of people are forced to hit rock bottom before they start rehab or Alcoholics Anonymous. So ultimately, in addiction, at some point, the pleasure you derive from having that thing, whether it's a glass of alcohol or a cigarette or drugs or whatever it is, that pleasure begins to decrease. From the first drink, it starts to decrease at some rate. You might not notice it at first, but when you have to go from one drink to two, you're doubling your intake just to get the same pleasure. That should tell you something. When you go from two drinks to four drinks to eight drinks, that should tell you that you're losing pleasure when you have alcohol. But none of us slow down to stop and think about these things. So we end up in a situation where we no longer get any pleasure from the object, from having a drink of alcohol. But at some point, even though we get very little or no pleasure from it at all, if we don't drink, we feel really, really awful. The, the displeasure of not drinking is so great that even though there's no pleasure from drinking, you still are forced to do it. You're pushed into doing it. You're compelled. You're helplessly forced to do it. And why is that? Just to avoid the displeasure of not having the alcohol. So as I said, eventually you have to hit rock bottom where your life becomes a complete mess and you realize that and you understand it's due to your alcohol consumption. And then you're forced to go through a process of sobriety. of becoming sober, and of day to day remaining sober. Every day of being sober, there are thoughts. You might have a thought of having a drink. And every time you have a thought, there's the same choice again. You have the choice to either go along with it or to stop, to back up, stand back and analyze, what's this going to do to my life? How's this going to affect my life? Is this really going to be more than just a temporary kick? So you might even take the support of friends or other sober people who are also going through the same situation to try and support each other emotionally and intellectually while you're going through this. To try and keep you company or to talk you out of your thoughts. But the best way is when you can do it for yourself, because you're not relying on the presence of another person. You don't feel like you're depending on anyone. You're just standing on your own 2 feet to analyze your thoughts and make sure that you don't go in a way that totally destroys your life. So again, addiction starts with one thought. There was a thought either sometime early in your life, or some would say in a previous life, where you had a thought of drinking, you had a drink, and that led to 2, and that led to 4, 6, 8, 10, and before you know it, it was you and alcohol were one. You merged with alcohol. You completely identified with it. So you have to kind of backtrack from that. If you want to get out of an addiction, you have to do extra work now to analyze the thought. When the first thought comes, it's pretty easy. It's not that difficult to say no to the first thought. But once you've done it a couple of times, the thought gets stronger, more powerful, more compelling. And then the longer you go along with the thought, the more often you go along with it, the more you'll get pushed by the thought. The thought will gather its own momentum. It'll be like Niagara Falls. You can't shut that off. And it takes an extreme amount of effort, an extreme amount of courage to become sober, to get sober after months, years, or decades of addiction. So we're not blaming anyone. Addiction is a terrible thing, and it's sad when a person feels like they have to descend into it, either because the rest of their life is in shambles or whatever the case may be. But ultimately, it's about an analysis of thought. When you have any thought and you don't analyze it, you are subject to be victimized by it down the line when it gains its own power and momentum and becomes more difficult to deal with. So when you have any thought, try and analyze it. For example, you may think, oh, there's a pretty woman. If you don't analyze that thought, that thinking about that woman can develop into a mental interest and then a desire for enjoying her company. And then if you keep on feeding that thought, if you're successful in the relationship, you get into a completely controlled situation. So again, it's all about the first thought. We're not saying it's wrong. We're not saying it's wrong to think that why not have a drink of alcohol, or isn't that woman pretty? There's nothing wrong with the thought, but if you don't check that thought, if you don't think about it, analyze it, and dismiss it, if it's not in line with your goals, then you're open to being taken advantage of, being victimized by the result of that thought, the result of pursuing or going along with those thoughts.